Brexit, which could be a second referendum or a general election or just cancel the whole thing, then we will crash out with no deal on the 29th of March at 11 p.m. Today's date of recording is the 27th of February, and I believe at the moment the plan is to turn off all the lights in the country and pretend that we're not in. The week before the Brexit referendum, somebody here on YouTube made a video about it. It was just a small little channel presented by some spotty twink with a terrible haircut. The Brexit campaign likes to talk about sovereignty. The idea is that by leaving the EU, Britain will have more of it. But what is sovereignty? I wonder whatever happened to that sweet little boy. In that video, though, the YouTuber in question was a little bit unfair to the Brexiteers. They talked about sovereignty, which was a pretty major issue in the run-up to the referendum, but they only talked about it in reference to immigration. And some of the commenters pointed out that there's actually a little bit more to it. The desire for more sovereignty needn't be such a terrible thing. Obviously, if it's just code for imprisoning immigrants without trial, then something's gone wrong. But the desire to have more control over society could be seen as an attempt to extend the spirit of democracy. Whilst I was criticising, I'd also say that aesthetically, this video is just terrible. No costumes, no makeup, no coloured lights. You could get away with anything in early 2016. Brexit is a useful opportunity to step back and think about democracy. Although the ancient Greeks are often credited with inventing it, they may not actually, there is an equally old and venerable history of questioning it. So why is democracy a good thing? Is it? Plato didn't think so. The ancient Greek philosopher famously thought that the ideal society would be run by philosophers. Oh really, Plato? You think everything would be great if people just listened to you all the time? You'll be starting a YouTube channel next. It's easy to write him off as being biased, but his reasoning was that the exercise of power requires a degree of moral expertise, which in his opinion could be taught. He thought that the rulers of society should be trained from birth to do the job, whereas a democracy favours not necessarily those who are good at governing, just those who are good at winning. Plato was bouncing off this question of what makes a good leader. We acknowledge that bad leaders in other domains, business or sports, and we acknowledge that you can actually train people to be better leaders. You can go on a course and learn how to do it. So he's coming at this from a position of saying, look, maybe an election isn't the cleverest way of finding out who should lead a country. Unless the only qualification for being the leader of a country that matters is winning an election. Which is definitely a road you could go down. The philosopher John Stuart Mill thought that the proper function of a representative government is not to actually lead the nation. It's not to be the experts on how to solve everybody's problems. It's to invest the experts with the moral authority to act, to keep the keys to power on behalf of the people. On that understanding, moral expertise and training could certainly be helpful, but the most important thing is that you win an election, so long as that election represents the people's will. And we will come back to that. In addition, we in the 21st century might be a little bit more skeptical about whether educating someone to be a ruler can be fair or unbiased. Because who gets to decide what the future rulers will be taught is going to hold the real power. Information is never just neutral, because somebody has to. Just like I'm not really capable of in an unbiased way. Arguably nobody is. The information that I put out there comes through one frame, and if it gels with yours, then great, but you might be approaching this whole thing from a completely different
In
2016, Paramount Pictures released Arrival, a science fiction film directed by Denis Villeneuve based on the short novel Story of Your Life by Ted Chiang. 12 alien ships arrive at various locations around Earth. They don't attack or make demands, they just open the doors and wait for humanity to introduce themselves. The problem is nobody can understand the alien language.
Teams
Of scientists around the world start trying to communicate with them in a coordinated international effort. Amy Adams plays a linguist called Dr. Louise Banks. Jeremy Renner plays an astrophysicist named Ian Donnelly, and Forrest Whitaker is the army colonel who recruits them into the American team. This isn't going to be a review of the film per se, but if you haven't seen it, it is pretty good, and I'm going to spoil the ending. One of the themes of Arrival is communication between different languages, and the possibility of multiple interpretations of the same thing depending on the framework from which somebody is operating. We get a great illustration of this in the first 12 minutes, and a nice character establishing moment for Louise when Colonel Weber first comes to her office to ask for her help.
I'm Colonel G. We never formally met, but 2 years ago you did some Farsi translations for Army intelligence. You made quick work of those insurgent videos.
You made quick work of those insurgents.
Just in case you missed the fact that Louise is approaching things through a different framework than the other characters, the film shows...
Lehet, hogy nem sebzett falon keresztül.
Are they capable of faster than light travel? Are they, a list of questions that, go over, starting with a series of just a handshake binary sequence.
How about we just talk to them before we start throwing math problems at them?
The US Army builds a temporary military base near where one of the alien ships is parked over rural Montana. When Louise first arrives, she learns that some people find encountering the aliens such a shock to how they view the world that they become physically and mentally ill. Nevertheless, she and Donnelly begin trying to teach the aliens just enough English to ask the all-important question, why are you here? Just for fun, contrast Arrival with the 1997 film Contact starring Jodie Foster, which is also about trying to communicate with aliens and the different frameworks through which people approach the task. There, it's more about a religious framing versus a scientific one, and Contact's most famous line at the end of the film expresses the idea that maybe there's room for both.
Poetry. I should have said a poem. So beautiful.
Mill actually had quite a complex relationship with democracy. On the one hand, he was a liberal and an early supporter of women's suffrage. He was a utilitarian, somebody who thinks that the best course of action is one that maximizes happiness for the greatest number of people. Utilitarianism is an ethical system rather than an explicitly political one, but it greatly informed his political work. He supported women's suffrage because, by extending the right to vote, we hopefully make sure that everybody's interests get represented and nobody gets overlooked, and that should, fingers crossed, maximize happiness. On the other hand, though, Mill didn't think that extended to barbarous races, and naturally, he was the one who got to separate the barbarians from the civilized folk. So he didn't think that Indians should be allowed to democratically run India, for instance, until Britain had taught them how to run India properly. And again, it was the British who were going to make the call about what it is to run a country properly. Mill thought that democracy was the best way of ensuring that everybody's interests get a fair shake. And one possible response to that, which his own attitude towards India kind of shows, is that it depends on how you do it. Mill himself acknowledges that you can have a bad system and not everybody can actually vote, and you can still call it democracy.
Szerintem kinyomták a reakciót az összes gépnek 100-ra.
Moreover, the ancient Athenians discovered that involving the people in civil proceedings is pretty expensive, and one of the major sources of that cash was the Athenian Empire, i.e., all the people outside of Athens who very much had an interest in a stake in what went on there and which way the votes went, but who weren't allowed to participate. They didn't call it the Delian League, which was clever of them. You generally don't want to call yourself the Empire openly. It's pretty bad politics. The Americans don't, and their empire's doing pretty well at the moment. So when we in Britain talk about our democracy inheriting a lot from the ancient Greeks, we might be more right than we realise. Rather like ancient Athens, we call what we've got a democracy, but it's just pull on that thread. Lord Cromer described Britain as a democracy in 1908, despite the fact that half the population couldn't vote because they were women. He also praised democracy whilst being the unelected military dictator of Egypt. There are still about 90 British citizens in the UK today who are not allowed to vote, a comparison that's slightly bigger than the constituency.
Az meg, összekevertem a kettőt.
Not to mention the several million folks who live here, work here, fall in love here, and whose interests are very much here, but
Rakétással akartam fölmenni, kirakétázva hoztak a csövet.
When Banks and Donnelly enter the spaceship, they make contact with two aliens who they nickname Abbott and Costello, after a pair of comedians whose most famous sketch is specifically about miscommunication and misunderstanding.
The fellow playing first base for St. Louis. Who? The guy on first base. Who is on first? What are you asking me for?
The humans decide to call the alien species heptapods, meaning 7 feet. There's some drama around the framing when Louise learns that the Chinese team of scientists are using a game of mahjong to communicate with their heptapods, which could lead them to interpret all the answers they get as being within
Én nem lőhetek rá.
win or lose framing.
Azt a kérdés.
Conversations with Abbott and
Dehogy nem. Mi a fasz?
the written version of the alien language
Ez a játék néha.
graphic. It conveys
Azt nem tudok vissza.
but it does not represent sound.
Nem kellett volna célzott lövést lenyomni.
Non-linear. It doesn't have a forwards or a backwards. Louise brings up the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, the idea that the language you use determines how you think, determines your framing. The strong version is that language determines your framing, the weak version is that language influences it. This raises the possibility that the heptapods might perceive even fundamental things like time very differently to humans. But Colonel Weber is concerned that the effort to communicate with the aliens is taking so long, and that his superiors are starting to worry they might be a threat. Louise tries to explain that they have to take it slow because even small miscommunications at the early stages can lead to big problems later on, by saying that when European colonizers first tried to ask Australian Aborigines what the name of the animal is, that hops around and carries its young in a pouch, the Aborigines said kangaroo. And only later did the colonizers discover that kangaroo means I don't understand. Colonel Weber takes the point, but reminds her what happened next.
Remember what happened to the Aborigines? A more advanced race nearly wiped them out.
Again, reframing the effort to communicate within the context of competition and aggression. Louise then confesses to Donnelly that the story about kangaroo is made up, but it proves her point. So, some people's interests don't get represented.
Fönn vagyok is tudtam.
And another potential problem is turnout. The turnout for the Brexit referendum was 72%. Remember, that's 72% of people who are allowed to vote, which may not be the same thing as the number of people who should be allowed to vote. But regardless, there are about 66 million people in the UK and about 47 million registered voters. So 47 over 66, that's about 71.2% of the population who are legally allowed to vote. The turnout for the Brexit referendum was...
Most remélem már végre kijön a próba ezek.
I'm cheating here because I have the answers written down. 51.3% of the population who actually voted.
Nem megy arrébb, nem bírom felvenni a pajzsot.
9% of that voted leave, which is 51.3 times 0.5. 26.6% of the population who actually voted leave. Just to cover the bases, Remain got 48.1% of the vote, so that's 51.3 times 0.581, which is like 24.7? Yes! 24.7% of the population who voted Remain. So, roughly 26.6% of people in the UK get to decide what happens to all the... This is an especially acute problem for the people of Scotland and Northern Ireland. Scotland voted Remain majority in every single council, but because Scotland is still part of the UK, at time of recording, they're being dragged along into Brexit as well. Ditto Northern Ireland, who were about 56% Remain. Is that a bad thing? Kind of depends on how you frame it. If, like Mill, you think that what's good about democracy is that everybody's interests get a fair shake, well, there was a choice. It doesn't mean the process wasn't fair. Could there have been more options, though? We'll come back to that. What this does show us is that democracy isn't necessarily about majority rule or popularity. In fact, it's consistent with a minority of people getting what they voted for. And by the way, this would still be true had the Brexit referendum gone the other way. And remember, turnout for Brexit was pretty high. If you run the maths on something like the American 2016 election, you'll find that Donald Trump's victory represents, at best, the fulfillment of the wishes of a pretty small minority of Americans, who get to decide what happens to all the rest. Not to mention all of the people outside of America who very much have an interest and a stake in what goes on there, but who don't get to vote because they too are seen as alien. And since we've been doing all that maths, it's a good time to bring up a point by scholar Stacey, who says that to the extent that democracy as we know it requires a certain level of cognitive ability, because you've got to know a lot of stuff and understand a lot of stuff in order to participate, it excludes at least some people with intellectual disabilities, who nevertheless are able to, and deserve to, exercise a degree of control over their lives. Which is to say, Mill, there are some interests that democracy should even if everybody can legally vote. Throughout Arrival, the public are presented in a very interesting way, because they're basically not in it. Most of the film takes place on the top secret base, except indirectly through news reports, we hardly ever see anybody who might be called the public. When the heptapods first arrive, we learn that people are panic buying food, petrol, and medicine, and that there are riots and looting. We see a handful of Louise's students, and we hear her talking to her mother on a phone, who is apparently scared and watches too much TV news.
Mom, please don't bother with that chain. How many times do I have to tell you those people are idiots?
We hear a soldier's wife briefly on the phone, who is also scared and doesn't know what's going on, and we see an Alex Jones-style talk show host say that America should give the aliens a show of force. This later inspires some of the soldiers on the base to go rogue and try to kill the heptapods and Louise and Donnelly by planting a bomb. But in terms of the public, that's about it. Throughout the film, the public are overwhelmingly portrayed as violent, ignorant, and criminal, despite the fact that the heptapods' arrival is something that very obviously concerns every human being on Earth. The public are never shown to have any kind of control over the interactions with them, or any ability to hold the representatives of their species accountable.
A person is smart. People are dumb, panicky, dangerous animals, and you know it.
The portrayal of the public throughout the film is in strong contrast to the military authorities, who are very intelligent and competent, albeit working within the wrong framework for the situation, with the exception of the rogue soldiers, and even they aren't presented as evil, just misguided. Contrast also the scientific authorities, chiefly Banks and Donnelly, whose morals and intentions are pure and who just need to be allowed to get on with their work. The communication with the heptapods is portrayed mainly as a technical problem that just needs the right expertise and time and a scientific approach to solve, rather than an inherently moral and political issue that needs to be handled in a way that respects the agency and frameworks of everybody who has an interest.
I think in this country have had enough of experts with organisations from acronyms
People of this country have had enough of experts.
We've seen that democracy as as inclusive or majoritarian as we might be. We should have a second referendum on Brexit, which I'm not necessarily opposed to, but it wouldn't fix any of the more fundamental issues with democracy that we've learned about. When it comes to turnout, though, there could be something we could do about it. Australia and Belgium and much of South America have compulsory voting, so turnout is always like 90-odd%. Although really compulsory voting is a bit of a misnomer. As long as you still have a secret ballot, you can't just walk in the booth and walk out again. Put a ballot paper in, but just leave it blank. Compulsory voting just means that you have to do it. What increases turnout so much is because most people get there and they go, well, I'm here anyway, I might as well do a democracy. In his paper Unequal Participation, political scientist Aaron Lichbart says that in low turnout scenarios, it's kind of like the people who do vote get to vote. And everybody who doesn't vote isn't represented in the system at all. Like with the Brexit referendum. 26.6% of the population voted Leave, 24.7% voted Remain, 48.7% of people unaccounted for. Because Leave just... all of that remaining bunch of people voted Leave as well, because it's winner takes all. The result gone the other way as well. But in a compulsory voting scenario, the winners presumably more accurately represent the will of the people, because you get a bigger sample size and find out what the majority really think. Proponents of compulsory voting also say that it might cut down on voter intimidation. Scaring people away from the polls is a little bit redundant when everybody has to vote anyway. It might also change the impact of money in politics. You don't have to spend campaign funds encouraging people to Pokemon go to the polls anymore. They're gonna Pokemon go anyway, so you can focus on communicating Pokemon good Pokemon governmental policy. In addition, one of the buggers about low turnout is that it tends to be wealthier, more educated people who do reliably vote, so their interests get disproportionately represented. Also, since wealth is often unequally distributed by race, you can end up with a pretty narrow swathe of people who get catered to by electoral politics. That's why more conservative parties tend to benefit in lower turnout elections. This isn't just something that lefties like me worry about either. Mill was concerned about it too. Lidgepart actually thinks that compulsory voting is morally required for democracy. On the flip side though, some say that compulsory voting would be a big restriction on people's freedom, even if the penalty was only something like a small fine. Philosopher Annabelle Lever said that if voting was in everybody's interests, that doesn't necessarily mean we'd be justified in forcing people into it. We all know that vegetables is good for you, but I don't think we'd be very pleased if the government started introducing fines for those who didn't get their 5 a day. Also, compulsory voting might nudge us towards thinking that voting is the be-all and end-all of democracy, when in fact other stuff, like protests and writing letters and even riots, can be important features of a healthy democracy. We presumably
Egyszerűen csak
protesting
szedem még azt az utolsót,
the voluntary
aztán
participation is kind of the point there. So why would we extend that to voting? After all, some people have good reasons why they don't want to vote. Grand Chief Michael Mitchell of the Akwesasne Council wrote in 1989 that Akwesasne people don't vote in Canadian elections because they ain't Canadian. They never surrendered their lands and were never conquered. So as far as they're concerned, ain't no such fucking thing as Canada, son. Go do Canada over there. Just because you look like the guy who presents Philosophy Tube doesn't mean you can get away with being a colonizer, Justin. So if we go down the compulsory voting road, we'd probably want to include some means by which people can conscientiously object. And let's be careful about what we do with that data. The last thing we want is the local anarchist group all registering as conscientious objectors to the election, and then at the next meeting, suddenly there's all these new members who are like, hey, my name's Robert, not a cop. Would any of you radical comrades like to
ezt kinyitom, az mindenképp megöl valakit.
Does anyone want to have a 6-year relationship and 2 kids before I tell you I'm actually an undercover cop sent here to spy on you? Because apparently that's a thing that we do now. That is a real thing that happened. Oh yeah. 6 years and 2 kids. And then he's like, I'm actually an undercover cop sent to spy on you. That happened multiple times. Yeah, that's fucked up, isn't it? I have to admit, I'm really not sure which way to go on compulsory voting. In the spirit of democracy, let me know what you think in the comments. And in the spirit of compulsory democracy, you have to let me know what you think. The Chinese military starts to get very worried about the possibility of the aliens attacking, and Colonel Weber decides the time has come to ask the big question. When Louise and Donnelly find Costello's purposes on Earth, they appear to say, offer weapon. But Louise isn't sure whether she's properly taught them the difference between a weapon and a tool. When the Chinese team ask their heptapods the same question, they interpret the answer they get as use weapon, which leads China to pull out of the joint operation, declare war on the aliens, and cease all communication with the other science team. The US also pulls out, the rogue soldiers decide their moment has come and set off the bomb, but not before the heptapods give Louise a final message. So democracy has some drawbacks, and the response of some philosophers has been to just try and do more of it, give more people the vote so more people can be included. But some have gone the other way and said that if exclusion is the name of the game, as it kinda looks like it is through some frameworks, then why not embrace it? Marx and other thinkers put forward the idea of a dictatorship of the proletariat, which they didn't name very well. Carl, baby, we need to have a talk about branding. Dictatorship here doesn't necessarily mean one person making all the decisions. What he means is a system of government that ideally is democratic, but excludes those whose economic interests are opposed to the majority of people. Kind of like how now in my country, prisoners aren't allowed to vote. We have a dictatorship of non-criminals, if you like. And the idea is that the interests of criminals are so fundamentally opposed to everybody else's that we simply shouldn't take them into account. Your mileage may vary on whether or not you think that's correct, but that's the idea. The dictatorship of the proletariat is where we say, okay, if you're a CEO, business owner, landlord, big-time millionaire capitalist, your interests are everybody else's, because through the Marxist framework you can only be those things by exploiting other people, but from now on, millionaires can't vote, can't hold office, can't donate to political parties, can't participate in politics. The government is supposed to be here to help people, and clearly you're doing alright for yourself, mate, so how about you just sit down? Through a liberal framework, that might look very scary, because, oh my god, we're taking people's votes away. That doesn't sound good? Think of all the struggles people had to go through to get the vote in the first place. What about this black woman who worked really hard and now she's a millionaire? You're taking her vote away. That really doesn't sound good. And yeah, that could look very scary. The response from the Marxist framework might be, though, that unlike historical...
Ki nem derül neki. Eddig nem tudtam soha becsukni semmi, csak a civil ajtókat, most meg hirtelen. Most már ezt is be tudod csukni. Mi a fasz?
Give up being a millionaire. And then you can vote again. Speaking of radical critiques, what if we look at democracy through an anarchist frame? Remember Mill said that the proper function of a representative body is to dole out the authority to govern? Well, an anarchist might say that you can't actually trade away the authority to govern yourself any more than you can rightly sell yourself into slavery. In so doing, you'd establish a hierarchy, whether consensual or not, and anarchists aren't fond of social hierarchy. Moreover, what if you vote for something on election day, and then 2 years down the line, when it actually starts happening, you've changed your mind? Or what if you vote for somebody and then they do something different than what they said they would do? Why should your vote of 2 years ago count as morally authoritative now if your interests and your will have changed? That's kind of one of the arguments behind some people wanting a second referendum on Brexit. And it's that kind of problem that representative democracy might have trouble dealing with. So some anarchists might say, even if we extend the right to vote massively, it still wouldn't be a good system.
2 hours ago, we pulled this audio off a secure channel in Russia. Someone on the science team there was broadcasting live.
Brexit means Brexit. The campaign was fought, the vote was held, turnout was high, and the public gave their verdict. The country voted to leave the European Union, and it is the duty of the government and Parliament to make sure we do just that.
Well, I mean, there are a lot of ways you can interpret what he said.
I don't need an interpreter to know what this means. And I'm telling you that no one else cares.
They might also say that the one-person, one-vote system can't take into account the subjective strengths of people's preferences. If there's an issue that I really care about, because it's life and death for me, then the votes of two people who don't really know anything about it and don't really care could outweigh mine. And is that fair? Maybe the people of Ireland, both North and the Republic, could have some sympathy with that criticism following the Brexit vote. Because there's places in the UK where you can just walk down the road and you're in the EU. No borders, no passports, nothing. And that's not an oversight, that's deliberate.
Ja, fasz.
Peace in Ireland. So how are we going to secure a border with the EU?
Eldönthető, hogy nem lő rá pajzsra, vagy micsoda. Ott sétálok előtte, bazd meg.
The people who live near the
A
border,
másik egy kockát lép, azt rálő. Ja,
If anyone does know how to solve that problem with the Irish border, please write your answer on a postcard and send it to Theresa May at 10 Downing Street, London.
Makes no fucking damn sense.
In addition, it's anarchists who point out that whilst we may live in what we call democracy, most of our lives are pretty undemocratic. If you work for a private company, you don't get to vote on what it does, even though you definitely have an interest in it. You don't get to vote on what your landlord does with their property, even though you definitely have an interest in that. So never
Visszalódolom, és máshol áll.
What if we extend the principle
Mi a
of
fasz?
governance by consent? What if we take back the country, but like really
Hello, Röjrám.
take it back? China gives the aliens 24 hours to leave their airspace or be destroyed. The international project appears to be falling
Ez mi, bazd meg?
to go to war, as Louise and Donnelly discover that the final message is one of only 12 pieces of a larger message, with the other 11
Ez mi?
science teams around the world. They advise the American military to share their teams,
Eznek semmi értelme, ezek nincs logika ebben, bazd meg.
a situation in which the wins and losses of all participants in the game do not add to zero.
Aki nincs, várjál, fegyvert kell neki adnom, hogy rálőjön.
The military refuse, convinced that the aliens will retaliate against the bombing and the Chinese aggression, and that nothing can now be done to stop the imminent war. Apparently,
Fogd meg egy gránátot akkor.
democracy. A study by the anti-racist advocacy group Hope Not Hate claims that the British public are losing faith in democratic institutions as a result of the Brexit. The Washington Post
Ez sparik mindenre, bazd meg.
2016 American election
Ezzel megmozdul, puff, lelövés.
distrustful to describe the apparently blossoming anti-democratic feelings of the American people. Supposedly we're becoming more divided and polarized, like this whole thing is
A kurva anyád, odaadom neki a pajzsot akkor. Sétáljon ő, hogyha annyira rá akar lőni.
interest in how their country country.
Úgy néz ki, kibagzolod, és az láthatatlan az ember.
We might call these epistemic virtues. Epistemic is the philosophy jargon word for to do with knowledge and knowing. The flip side of that, though, is that a lack of democracy could promote bad characters and epistemic vices.
It is a great discouragement to an individual, and a still greater one to a class, to be left out of the Constitution, to be reduced to plead from outside the door to the arbiters of their destiny, not taken into consultation within.
We might want to reply to Mill that people's characters are affected by a lot more than just the political system they live under. But this idea of democracy relating to epistemic character is a theme that philosopher Jose Medina epistemic resistance. Medina wants us all to become a little bit more aware of how we construct the frames
pajzsban.
see the world. For instance, I've talked on the show before about how a lot of professional philosophy tends to be written by white people.
Oh,
the kind of stuff that gets written. Epistemic resistance might involve challenging that.
If you immerse yourself into a foreign language that you can actually...
Van egy kurva ötletem. Oda megyek pajzsal. Átváltok izéra. Minigánra, és szétlövöm, és visszaveszem pajzsra.
Medina might say, no, that's a feature, not a bug of democracy.
That's a feature, not a bug. Aha, ja.
Numbers of people voting because there are more ideas in the public sphere than perhaps there were before. More frameworks from which to choose.
És ki a pajzshoz, mehetek vele, mert soha nem lőnek rám.
To describe the dominant value system of a society through which its members view almost everything. And arguably one of the most useful and terrifying things about democracy is that it contains within it both the possibility for unjust hegemonies to form and the seeds of epistemic resistance against it. It constantly invites us to consider radically different ways of looking at things and poses just how willing we are.
Shield of invisibility.
The flip side of that is, though, what do we do when people form their frameworks based on bad info? There was a lot of misinformation around the time of the Brexit referendum. In fairness, some on both sides. The most notorious lie was the Leave campaign saying that by Brexiting we were going to get 350 million extra.
Most már nem ugrik át. Hát ez van egész semmi konzisztencia nincs a bajátékban.
They also said that Turkey was about to join the EU and so immigration would go up, which turned out to be false. The Remain campaign might have overestimated the number of manufacturing jobs that we're going to lose. The Leave campaign actually committed electoral fraud and were fined because they used the Canadian firm Aggregate IQ to push lies in Facebook ads in the crucial days before the election, and then they didn't declare it. Some people say that makes the whole referendum a bust and that we should have a do-over. But if I form my will that I get because my personal data is harvested
a pajzsossal kell kinyitnom az ajtót, különben azonnal lő.
Ads with lies in them, does that make my vote invalid? Are we going to say, like Plato, that there's a good and a bad way to make decisions for the nation? Or are we going to say that it doesn't really matter whether your will has been led astray, as long as your vote represents your will, you have a right to be wrong? I voted Remain because I wanted to be and I was like, I kind of don't want to mess with it. I don't know, so let's just kind of not touch it. And you might say, that's a terrible reason to vote. And you could well be right there, but do my reasons actually matter, so long as my vote represents what I want? And what if people make their democratic decisions not based on information at all, but based on something else? A lot of the Brexiteers who talk about us becoming a global power again seem to think that this is a chance for Britain to gain some status, whatever the economic and political situation turns out to be. And status can be maintained even in the face of disaster, arguably disaster. In their podcast, How to Survive the End of the World, the Brown sisters sometimes have trouble convincing their fellow Americans that when the police kill somebody, that's a bad thing. It's harmful. They say that a lot of the people they talk to seem stuck in this framework of when the police kill somebody, that's okay. Almost like they're using a different definition of the word harm. And they wonder whether that might have something to do with the fact that America was founded using slavery and genocide, which is still not recognized as harmful by many of the people who continue to benefit from it. Britain is a global power now, at least in part because the British Empire brought a lot of wealth here. And whatever you think of that history, you surely got to admit that we are not commonly encouraged to examine the empire through the eyes of those for whom it was a very bad thing. A lot of us are used to thinking of our country as high status, and of imagining status in a certain way by virtue of being British. And Medina might say that can be an epistemic vice when it cuts us off from knowledge that we might otherwise find very useful. Desperate to avoid open conflict, Louise sneaks aboard the alien ship and meets Costello face to face. She asks again why they've come to Earth, and Costello says that they want to help humanity, because in 3,000 years' time, they will need humanity's help. Louise asks how the aliens can know the future, and then discovers that learning heptapod has rewired her brain and allowed her to perceive time as they do, non-linearly. We as the audience discover that what we thought were flashbacks to her life with her daughter, who died young of a congenital disease, are actually flash forwards. Louise is seeing her future, knows that she will conceive a daughter with Donnelly who will die. Despite the inevitable loss of her child, however, she ultimately decides to go ahead anyway. I wasn't the only YouTuber to make a video just before the Brexit referendum. Critic and online gamer H Bomber Guy made one too, in which he said this:
"We haven't had enough of experts. We don't have any experts. Under a representative democratic system, the majority of people haven't had to think about this stuff for a long time. It stands to reason that they don't know enough to make these decisions. In a way, the greatest criticism of representative democracy, that it shelters people from having to understand economics and politics because someone else is doing the thinking for them, has come home to roost. Now even our leaders have no fucking idea."
Arguably, Harry was channeling Plato there. If Twitter has shown us anything, it's that the people in charge of running stuff often don't have a clue what they're doing. Michelle Obama has gone on record as saying this:
I've been at probably every powerful table that you can think of. I've worked at nonprofits, I've been at foundations, I've worked in corporations, served on corporate boards, I've been at G summits, I've sat in at the UN. They're not that smart.
At the climax of the film, Louise uses her knowledge of the future to make a phone call to the Chinese General Shang and tells him, "In war, there are no victors, only widows." A phrase that has special emotional significance to him because those were the last words of his wife. This inspires him to stand down and share his fraction of the message with the other teams, which ultimately leads to peace, not only between humans and heptapods, but humans and other humans. It's not scientific expertise or a military victory that saves the day. In fact, it's the antagonists of the film who stick only to one kind of knowledge and a competitive perspective. Ultimately, it's a display of emotional vulnerability on the part of two people who feel trapped within their frameworks that enables everybody to break out of them. Through one frame, the fragility of democracy and the possibility of it going wrong is a terrifying argument against it. But if it's true that it does affect our epistemic characters, then by realizing democracy's drawbacks, we open up opportunities not just to make it better, but to better ourselves as well.
Menni kell dolgozni.